I love this shot. And you know, one of the sort of underreported, underappreciated environmental issues is the loss of the dark night sky. And I live in Westchester County, above New York City in New York. Love to take my kid out stargazing, but I'll tell you, you really can't do it anymore. We've lost the darkness of nature. And this also is a great, obviously, illustration of how much habitat we've lost across the country. Just to whip through some of the statistics, 27 U.S. ecosystems out of 76 have declined by at least 98% since the European colonization. Only 2%, 3% of our historical virgin forests remain in the lower 48, and we've lost over 50% of our wetlands. Protection varies in terms of habitat on public lands. And I could go on some of the problems in terms of habitat. Approximately 5% of our country is now protected in wilderness and private reserves. Another 3 to 5%, and it's a real sort of fudgy figure, is in wilderness study lands, on public lands, also roadless areas. But these are all vulnerable. We saw during the Bush administration when he took away the roadless rule, which basically took millions of acres out of protection back into development, logging and mining, etc., just how vulnerable these lands are. So, but at least these lands are relatively pristine, but they need to be protected. Least protected lands in our country are in the valley bottoms. I mean, obviously, as Paul said, hey, we're smart people. You know, we went where the best soils and the best farming land was, and that's where much of our country is most developed, in the very fertile sort of plains and valleys. But the problem is, much of our wilderness areas, national parks, protected areas, are what they call rock and ice. I mean, you know, the core areas, some of them substantial, but we're now finding that we need to link together these core areas in order for species to survive. Now, the question is, what needs to be done in terms of habitat? And here's, I found this a very illuminating slide right here. IUCN called for, well, actually a little late because, you know, there was very little progress before 2000, but still the target for habitat protection worldwide is 10% of all major habitats. You look at this chart and you see basically that you're going to lose, as a percentage here, between 30 and 55% of species if we only save 10% of habitat. International studies, and there's been extensive studies, basically show we need to get that up to 20 or 30%. 30% or more would be ideal. And again, the numbers, as you go up the curve, are not as high as you would like, but let's face it, protecting 30% of habitat would be an extreme challenge currently. We've been supporting the Wildlands Project for a number of years, and this is a grand continental conservation vision. It's very exciting, and it's really basically creating wildlife corridors across our continent. And of course, it dips down a little bit into the Great Plains, and this is an older slide. They're now talking about a buffalo commons along the Great Plains that would literally be millions of acres. Sort of our Serengeti, where we can have ecotourists go out and look at buffalo, you know, maybe even seeing a puma if you're very lucky on the plains. But these grand visions are actually very practical as well, because really, if we want to save species, especially in light of climate change, we're going to need that kind of connectivity. And we're going to need big spaces. I mean, if you're talking about ecosystem regulators, the keystone species like the grizzly bear and the wolf, they need big territory to roam. And again, one big problem is much of the connectors between these core areas is in private lands. And that's a lot of money that you need for acquisition. But as you'll see, there's greater challenges to this connectivity. Land conversion in the United States is currently 2.2 million acres a year. That is open space that's farmland, forest, other open space areas. And that's a figure that's been increasing over the past couple decades. And as we heard today from Phil, it's 50% of that is due to population growth, according to studies. And remember also Gus Speth's quote where he said, "What is not protected will be paved." And that's what we're seeing. And I'll tell you, it's very depressing to go to a conference on Western land conservation and basically hear our activists say, you know what, we're losing the battle. We're losing. And, you know, despite the 4,000 environmental groups in the United States, and we become a model for land conservation. We actually currently conserve a little bit less than 2 million acres a year. That's been the rate over recent years in private lands. And yet, it's not really enough. We're really in a race here for connectivity. The other big factor and sort of the curveball in all of this, of course, is going to be climate change. And just to give you an example, you increase the temperature by 4 to 5 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, and that could reduce the habitat of cold water fish by 1/4 to 1/3. That's just climate change alone. We're not talking about, you know, the future dam building, the future needs of agriculture that are going to continue to suck particularly our western rivers. But climate change is going to put a layer over all of this. And the other thing is, and I mentioned it before, fragmentation continues. It makes it more difficult for Phil's pika to move upwards or actually northwards. And they're now figuring in terms of climate change, species are going to have to move 200 miles to the north of where they are now. How are they going to do it if you've got highways they got to cross, or subdivisions, or, you know, actually suburbs that stretch for miles? Now, when I'm debating this with my environmental colleagues, the smart growth often comes up as the solution. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And I'll tell you, it's perhaps a partial answer. Their idea is that we can accommodate another 100 people through infill. Sorry, 100 million people. Daydreaming again here. That's only 100 people. Within the next 40 or so years, by basically making our population denser and denser. Well, that doesn't speak to the fact that a lot of people, you know, who are living in nice areas now don't want to have that kind of infill take place. But let's just disregard that. One of the reasons it's not going to make that much difference is that the energy and food requirements for suburban subdivisions essentially the same as for urban development. Now, you do gain in other areas like transportation. If you live in Manhattan, you're insane to own a car, for instance. But you're likely going to be renting a zip car and driving out on weekends, and you're going to take maybe longer vacations, etc. But you're probably going to save on transportation. But what they found is these urban areas require greater trucking of food into those urban areas, and there's a transportation cost there. So again, you know, it's only a partial solution. Example I like to use is Vancouver, which is put up on a pedestal for one of the continent's best smart growth cities. It's actually a very nice city. Here, what's happening here between just 10 years, it's kind of subtle, but actually you can see they've stayed within these urban boundaries. It's a little bit denser. There's a little bit more orange on the right slide. But they're obviously doing a good job, and they say that, within the city, there's something like 16 out of the 21 communities within the city are considered smart growth neighborhoods. Okay, well, the problem here is that you've got 114 square kilometers of the urban area, but an ecological footprint for these urban dwellers that are 200 times the actual size of the city. It actually comes to you start with 114 square kilometers, and the footprint, and this is according to William Rees, who developed the ecological footprint. So he's right there. He lives in Vancouver. The footprint is 23,600 square kilometers. So great, the population of Vancouver increases, and that larger footprint increases. And so there is a cost even to smart growth. You're basically residentially, you're compacting people, but the overall footprint is very similar. This is a classic footprint. Actually, for Canada, of course, they do things better than we do in the United States. We've got a footprint of about 22 acres. Canadian footprint is 15. A little bit higher than Europe's, which is generally about 12 or 11. It's obviously all the things I've talked about here. The urban land is just a small part of it, but you've got all sorts of uses, including the carbon footprint. Sometimes confuses people. This is basically the forest we need to help suck in that carbon. Without it, more of it's going to go into the atmosphere. So it's looking at where our wastes are going to go.